considered trying to add a couple of things to this, but I figured it's the end of January, we'll just keep it simple and talk about the two major releases in theaters. So, let's start with Gretel and Hansel, which is a movie I was surprised to already be talking about because I remember seeing, like, Sophia Lillis talking about this a while back, I think when she was, like, promoting Sharp Objects or something. And from the looks of it, just from like the posters and stills, it looked like something that was just going to kind of be like straight to DVD. And as it went on, I'd never realized how much of a wide release it was going to be. And now, after having seen it, I'm kind of shocked that this got like a full-on release. Because it is probably not what a lot of people are thinking, especially for the demographic they're probably going for by giving it a wide release. But one of the things I didn't notice till much later into its like press and whatever is that Oz Perkins directed it, who obviously is the son of Anthony Perkins, but he also directed an effective sort of like in the indie vein horror movie a few years ago with the Blackcoat's Daughter, which I was kind of mixed on. Like, it is like he really showed promise as a horror director in particular with that. And while there were many things about it that were great, there was also quite a lot that maybe wasn't as much. And this pretty much falls exactly in the same vein as that. Like, coming out of this, I feel pretty much exactly how I felt coming out of The Blackcoat's Daughter, which means he's consistent, but he's still... I mean, I think it's much more in the writing where his movies tend to... or these two movies tend to kind of fall apart, especially when you're getting closer to the end. But as far as like visuals go and just his general sort of like aesthetic, he's clearly already shown that he's extremely talented in this area, and I'm sure he will continue to be, and will probably get even better at it as it goes. So this is still kind of a really nice stepping stone to whatever he's going to end up doing next. And there was, especially later on, it was starting to get a lot of comparisons going into The Witch as far as its aesthetic and I guess the subject matter too, obviously. And yeah, I can see where that comes from, especially with it almost feels like a combined almost Robert Eggers tribute accidentally, where it's because not only does it just kind of have the feel of The Witch, and a witch plays a major role in the movie, obviously, but something I didn't know until I was watching it was the he's playing with the aspect ratio, sort of like we just saw Eggers do with The Lighthouse. But the interesting thing about this is it is clearly going for that classic feel, especially when you see... I talked about another release recently where it's like, it's so weird to be seeing the Orion logo again at the beginning of movies, because that company was like dead for so long, and it feels so like almost nostalgic to see it again, and you can tell they kind of put a sort of like an older, almost finish on it to make it look like it did in like the 80s and early 90s. And it's got, you know, that score. It's an awesome score, by the way, because the whole sort of 80s-esque score is something that I kind of thought has been wearing thin for quite some time now. People were way overusing it there, and sort of like when stuff like It Follows was coming out and stuff like that, and Stranger Things, I think it just started. And I feel like that kind of lost its, you know, appeal after a while because so many people were doing it, but it's used really well here, I think. And you see like this opening imagery with all that other stuff, and it is something where I think they could have gone, because it is something where you can kind of sense that this clearly, as I was saying, doesn't look like it was made for a wide release. It looks like that was somebody's like last minute decision at the studio, and you can sense that there might be some things in here that probably weren't necessarily in Perkins's original cut. Mainly involving voiceover, because there's a lot, it's like a bookend. There's the whole beginning sequence and then the very end sequence where they use voiceover over the imagery to basically sort of explain it. It's sort of like the way Dark City started before the director's cut put that shit to rest and made the movie better because of it. But you're watching the imagery and it's like, it almost kind of does it a disservice, because it does seem like I feel like it would have been much easier to set in like an eerie atmosphere if we were just looking at this imagery without it. Maybe not so much in the beginning as it is in the end, because in the end it's definitely just, for exposition reasons. But I can kind of understand it at the beginning because it's the whole, we're being told like a separate fairy tale from it. Like it's a fairy tale that Gretel has been told in her youth and she recalls to Hansel, and it's their whole thing. And so that sort of giving it that sort of fairy tale feel by having, narration over the imagery like it's a story within this fairy tale we already know of. So that is an interesting approach to that, but even so, it was like I felt like the imagery probably lost a little bit of its effect and probably would have been super super eerie if it just kind of stood on its own. But I get in the first part why that would be there, so there is that. But also talking about the aspect ratio where we get the because the opening fairy tale, that opening imagery is told and like it's really really wide, and then the entire rest of the movie is in the sort of more compact one. There is, I'm not quite sure how to explain that technically without getting to like speaking a foreign language, but that's, yeah, you get it. If you saw The Lighthouse, you know what I mean. And then, but on top of that, there's also a lot of like shaky cam, particularly when it's just like shots of Gretel walking, interestingly enough. Like when there's a whole lot sort of going on or they're building up to a lot of stuff, everything is like really stable. But when it's sort of just the mundane, then it kind of goes into the shaky cam. And I think that's really, I'm not quite sure what the intent is, but what I took away from it was I found that like a really interesting reversal of what you expect of that sort of thing and things being shot in that particular way. And that makes the fact that when everything goes into such a standstill, when something freaky is happening, that seeing the shaky cam with the more mundane stuff actually makes that more effective, because it's like everything stops like the way it would if you were, running into something terrifying in the woods. Like everything would like stop and slow down, and that's pretty much what happens and what it looks like from the actual way that it's shot. And of course, we have, because the names are reversed in the title, that means that Gretel is the main focal point here, which is a move that I'm not sure I'd be entirely behind, because it would almost feel like a gimmick, to where it's like you're telling the same story, but you're saying it's from more so Gretel's perspective. But it seems like that's because you're still going to be telling the same story anyway. So is that just something to kind of look like you're doing something different when you're not actually? But as soon as I realized that, because one of the first things I learned about the movie was that Sophia Lillis was Gretel, and then it was like, oh, okay, yeah, you can make Gretel the main focal point, because after It Chapter 1, it is very clear that Sophia Lillis is a fucking star, and if there's any justice in the world, she is only going to get bigger until she is just enormous. And it's like so incredibly talented and promising, and I always can't wait to see what she, even when she's in something I don't particularly like Sharp Objects, I didn't care for. It's still like there's gonna be so much later in her career that she'll be able to do. That she's already shown that in just the few things we've seen her in already, and that's so I'll just follow her anywhere. And then we have this scene early on where in another movie, a more poorly done movie, I would probably criticize it by the movie trying really hard to not be boring. But they do something here that's a really interesting and unsettling way to like set off this feel throughout it, because it feels like the movie is really really short. It is under an hour and a half. But it feels like it's a while into the movie. It almost feels like it's like borderline halfway before they even find the witch's house. But they set up this whole uncomfortable feel the whole time by their first run-in with somebody that they really don't want to be running into is this... I'm not even quite sure what he is. But it's like this... I guess it's a person, but they look inhuman. And they accidentally end up in the same place as this dude. They go in there to sleep, and that's, as they're laying down to sleep, is when they discover he's in there, and it's this freaky ass shot of Gretel laying in the foreground, and he just sits up like fucking Michael Myers, like right next to her. And that scene is so jarring, but it seems like it has nothing to do with anything, is the thing. Is why I would say I'd probably criticize it if it was in a shittier movie. But about it setting up the whole thing is there's so many things it sets up. Because there's the whole thing of, yeah, we're expecting a witch, but that dude or whatever he is also shows that we're not exactly sure what all we're in for and what all they can run into. So that kind of puts you on edge already. And then there's the whole thing where they get out of this situation because of a hunter of sorts that they run into. And this guy is like so incredibly conveniently there, and that immediately occurs to Gretel, to where every time they run into something, she's like, this is way too convenient. Something is definitely wrong here, and I feel like anything we run into is potentially cahooting. So anybody that looks trustworthy may not be, and that alone sets up a whole sort of paranoia aspect all before they even get to the witch's house. And kind of sets up the whole Gretel not being as, like, it's gonna take a lot to lure them in, but obviously the whole idea of making Hansel a sort of, impressionable younger brother that's just there as like a tag along, and she'll inevitably have to follow him to certain places, and then that will get them into the shit that they get into. And yeah, I really appreciate a lot of like the classical approaches that Perkins is kind of taking here as far as visuals go. Like the kind of just the whole idea. This is what I really appreciated about Eggers' movie too, was this whole idea of making witches scary again. Because for a while there, when you thought of witches, you thought of stuff like witches and like bumbling witches in like animated movies or something like that. But here, and it's or stuff like like Hocus Pocus. Not to shit on Hocus Pocus for any reason, but yeah, it's really, witches were like for a while felt like this sort of untapped territory for a while, for like a large piece of time, where you could do something like really freaky and horrific with it. And because like when you see the silhouettes, because that's another sort of, it almost feels like a classic approach, that's underutilized in horror movies, that's really effective, is just the silhouette of something that looks terrifying. And we get that a lot in this movie also, and just that whole recognizable silhouette of a witch with like the hat and everything. The fact that we can make that scary again after all the different iterations we've seen of witches in the past, mostly comedic or cartoon-like or whatever, recently, this is definitely, they could really continue to make a comeback with this, and because there's a lot of stuff they can do with that. So, as far as what most people probably expect out of horror movies, especially these days, I was pleased, and I wasn't really expecting it, because he is like, an inspired enough filmmaker that he wouldn't resort to this too much, and you can sense that early on in the movie. The jump scare factor is pretty limited. They're in there, but once again, it's like somebody, I think in the middle of this, or maybe after the movie had already been made the decision this was going to be a wide release. So we can't always, automatically assume some of the more, cliche stuff or studio-friendly stuff was here before. We don't know. But there is, a bird that, flies out suddenly. There's one towards the beginning, and that's about it. There's maybe 2 or 3. And they're not even that, overdone. So, like you might flinch for a second, but they're not like, the deafening shit you'd get in, the other horror movies lately. So there is that. All the shit in the garage, stuff like that. So, I do think not only will people be frustrated with this, because it probably won't be a lot of what the demographic is expecting, there's also a lot of the, after a while, it can start to feel pretty redundant. It's one of those movies where, almost every time, once they're at the witch's house, almost every time something, scary or horrific happens, it's immediately followed by one of the characters sitting up in bed like it was a dream. There's a lot of that. But at the same time, to its credit, there is that whole thing of, maybe it wasn't. But, like I said, it just kind of adds a sort of redundancy in kind of the last third of the movie that might, make people zone out. There was, talking about how people aren't going to get what they're expecting, and it being a bit more like, I guess, artsy is how you would describe it. The woman at the end of my row was looking at her phone for like the entire second half of the movie. I don't think, I don't think it was what she was expecting, and I imagine there's going to be a lot of that, unfortunately, very very unfortunately. But that's the risk they take giving this a full release. But it is still nice to see horror movies like this, or like The Witch, getting releases like this. I did have to drive like 45 minutes to see The Lighthouse, but The Witch was here, so there's that. And this is here, so, still good on the studios for trying to get stuff like this out there, even if it's not by any means perfect stuff. Like I said, stuff that certainly runs out of gas before it's over, even despite a runtime that's under an hour and a half. You can see where a problem would lie there, and there's also kind of a pacing problem where, despite being under an hour and a half, it doesn't feel like that. It feels longer than that, and there are some cases where I think that actually serves the story for the better, but here I do think, especially since it's a story we know, and it's not really that elaborate, there's no reason for it to not feel its length at under an hour and a half. This could have felt much faster than it actually is, but yeah. And there's still, some freaky stuff sprinkled in there throughout that may not necessarily be in, or at least well known about the original story. Like we got ghost kids in this one. But they're, once again, that's not something that's as dumb or overbearing as it sounds, and, just, that's just kind of I guess you could almost say a cheap thing with me, because it's really in any movie, even if it's shitty, ghost kids are gonna freak me out. So, even if the movie's terrible, that's something with me you'd probably get away with. So there is that. And there's all these, creepy little touches throughout. Sometimes quite literally, where this ongoing thing where the witch just keeps running her fingers through Hansel's hair, like every time he's there at the table. And so yeah, there's a lot of, the creepy vibe sort of looming over it. And like I said, there's that really looming factor in the first half when they set up all this stuff that may not even be important or even here in the second half, but I appreciate that it's there to set up the feel as it goes in, and it kind of keeps hanging over as we go into the second half, and it gets into the more familiar territory, which does try to go in some of its own directions, which don't always pay off either, but I said, it's more or less, it's a movie I at least appreciate for its style and kind of go on that route of doing it. Because the thing is it can seem really obvious very quick if you're doing, trying to do the classic vibe, like the aspect ratio thing, or the score thing, or the way it's shot, or whatever. It could be really easy to point out, they're being very gimmicky with it. But it felt appropriate enough that I wasn't distracted by it and didn't see it as gimmicky. It felt like it really fit with the way the story was being told. So I didn't mind any of that. And if anything, it actually did work to enhance it. But yeah, some of the story points and some of the redundancy kind of bring it down a little bit. But it's fine as long as you know what you're in for. But if you don't know what you're in for, those people are going to be pissed, probably. So, and it's probably going to get terrible word of mouth, sadly, but that's the way it's going to be. Or maybe I'm underestimating people, but we'll see. So, let's go into the other movie that came out this weekend with the rhythm section. And I only really saw this for one reason, because I've made it clear, I think, that I don't get the Blake Lively thing. I know it's that couple, I guess. I'm not into the Ryan Reynolds thing, and I don't get the Blake Lively thing either. They're just, neither one of them is for me, I guess. But the thing that attracted me to this movie, and the one thing that made me say, I'm going to see this in theaters when it comes out, is that Reed Morano directed it. She did that indie movie a couple years ago, The Apocalypse one with Peter Dinklage, I Think We're Alone Now, which isn't great. But her movie Meadowland with Olivia Wilde was one of my favorite movies of its year, and it's still terribly, terribly underseen. And I loved that movie. Just completely and totally knocked me to the ground. And from that point on, it was I will see anything this director does. And it's, yeah, I don't want to say, because she's still early in her career. There's still plenty of room for her to do other stuff. So I don't want to say yet that Meadowland was a one-hit wonder. But as of now, we're headed in that direction. As of now. There's still time. But in the meantime, we have this revenge movie with Blake Lively and Jude Law and Sterling K. Brown. It's a decent cast. Richard Brake is in there briefly. And it's one of those movies where you can kind of tell immediately that because the thing about it is you can tell really quickly when a movie loses its confidence, or when you kind of get a fear in you that the movie's not confident in itself. So this is one of those movies where it starts at a moment when it looks like it's a really, really dramatic moment, and it's what looks like it could be potentially a climatic moment. And then we jump back in time 8 months, and we realize that we're going to circle back around to this moment. And then it's like, that always gives me pause in a movie, because it's like the movie's terrified that people are going to be bored with it. And so they're like, well, we have to start with something, because the actual start of our story isn't interesting enough. We got to give them something that's going to hook them before we go into like the opening credits and what that shows off. So that's always alarming to see when they feel like they have to do that. And then you go into the whole opening, and we get like the whole family opening, because the idea is that Blake Lively's family was supposedly killed in a plane crash, but then, I guess you'd almost say Unbreakable style, maybe it wasn't an accident at all. And then when she figures out, who was behind this through the help of Jude Law and some other guy, then she goes on, basically turns into a one-person Munich, is basically what it is. Just, kill everybody responsible one by one in really violent ways. And, of course, because of this tragedy, she's, like, all drugged out, she's a prostitute, she's got all of her hair chopped off for some reason. I don't know when that came into play, but, and her face looks like she hasn't slept in a week. And I don't want to hate on Blake Lively, because I like the stuff that she's trying to do, and it's working for a lot of people. So, like, that's so great on her for making these decisions. Like, I know a lot of people loved her in A Simple Favor and thought that was something really different for her to do. I kind of hate that movie and her in it, but it worked for a lot of people. And here, it's like, she's got all the hair chopped off, and it's like pitch black dark, and she's got the face where it looks like she hasn't slept for a week. And you can just hear people and critics in the, well, not critics, but people in the audience, like, applauding, saying, transformation. And it's like, this is a great performance because she transformed into this character that looked nothing like her, because she's, like, uglified when Blake Lively is, clearly attractive, and so clearly not here. But the thing is it's like, it's one of those cases where I'm wondering just how much credit people are going to give to the performance just based on her appearance. Just based on what the makeup and hair people did to her. Versus the actual performance. And the actual performance is fine, but like I said, I think the performance itself is going to get a lot more of the credit than just what's been done to her by makeup people, which is doing a lot of the work as far as the transformation goes. So, when we have these opening scenes, it is like the movie trying to look busy. We get a lot of stuff that's in, like, like, I've talked about this so many times before, especially with straight-to-DVD movies. You can just tell by a movie's aesthetic pretty quickly. If you've seen enough movies, if there is a movie doing something with its visuals in, like, the first 5 minutes that you recognize only from bad movies, you kind of get a sense of it. So, we get our flashbacks in blurry vision, where and that's where we get a lot of the family stuff. And it's a lot of the same footage used over and over again, just flashing in randomly. There's like a whole array of it during the opening credits, and then the same footage keeps flashing whenever she, wants to get revenge or remembers something, or it's time for her to be sad, because that's her character arc, because the script says so. Not that you're feeling it by watching it like you should be, but you can tell the script is telling you that's what's happening, so, yeah. But that's the thing about this movie, though, is that it's really frustrating because it only half sucks. It's the whole thing. It's not like the movie starts off good and then it starts to suck, or it doesn't start off sucking and gets better. It's back and forth the whole time. Just when you're like, oh god, this is going to be terrible, it does something and you're like, oh wow, that was a good scene, or that was a good technique they did with the camera or something. And then just when you're like, okay, I think it's going to start to get better now, it starts sucking again. And then you fall back into that and you're like, oh, well, okay, the movie is going to suck. That scene before was just a fluke. And then another scene happens that's way too good to be in the hole that is this movie. And it's like, oh, okay. And then it's just that back and forth the whole time. So it never made up its mind if it wanted to be good or if it wanted to be shitty. It was trying to be both simultaneously. It was just alternating. So, on top of the stuff that's shitty, which is really mainly just, the movie's just kind of hard to get into, and I don't know if that's me not being into Blake Lively at all, or what it is, but I don't know, because it kind of, the story itself, and how she gets from one place to the other, just feels so messy, and all over the place, and it's like, at one point we're here, and then suddenly we're here, then suddenly we're here, and it just... Yeah, and it just all feels jumbled, and you try really hard to, like, the plot is very basic. Like, there's not a whole lot like, that's not what's gonna lose you. What's gonna lose you is just, like, there was a dude right in the row in front of me that got up a little over an hour in, I would say, and he never came back. And I get... I mean, I don't really, completely get people that walk out of movies. I can get turning a movie off at home, but I've never quite understood walking out of a movie at the theater, but obviously it happens all the time. But this guy clearly... and because it was during one of the decent scenes that this guy left, and I felt like that said a lot. To where it's like, this is a movie where it just does not hook you right away, and it has to keep trying to win you over, and it's hard to like, because it's just... So I don't even know. I don't know if it's the characters or the style or what it is, but it's just really hard to invest in, and they're trying so hard with the emotional beats that this Lively character has to go through, and to me they just weren't landing. It just felt like a script working the gears of it. Until those scenes would come in. There's a couple of shots that are really good in the way that, like, there's one when it's just Lively walking down a road and there's like mountains or hills like in the background. It's like this really gigantic landscape shot, and she's so tiny in that frame, but it's like, because it kind of shows like this whole mission. It's practically a one-person thing, and it's like you can kind of see just how almost against the world it is. And we get a similar shot when she's in water walking through it that Jude Law makes her do to get home, and so shots like that work. And then there is a scene where Jude Law's like training her, and he just starts a fight with her. Like, he just slams her head against the table. And it occurs to her, it's like, oh, this is part of the training, we're gonna fight now. And she, like, pulls a knife on him, and he's, like, taking it from her, and, like, giving it back to her, and she keeps trying to do this. And it was halfway through this fight that I realized there aren't cuts in it, at least visible ones, or ones that I don't remember, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it was, like, all one shot, and it was one of those things where I love that I didn't notice till halfway through, because it's not drawing attention to itself. It's like the camera's in one place, and they're only in this sort of confined room, and the camera just sort of moves back and forth as they do this. And there's like there's some pretty precise choreography involved, given there's a knife involved. And yeah, it looks like it's all in one shot. And so stuff like that is great. And then there's another similar thing that almost had, it's a little much to say Children of Men vibes, but they were on the right track. there is a car chase. This is the scene the guy walked out on for some reason. This is a good scene. It is a full-on car chase. Like a really full-on car chase. But the camera never leaves the inside of the car. The camera is in the passenger seat and only looks out through the windshield, at Lively in the driver's seat, and out through the back window, and just does that. We never leave the car in this car chase, and I thought that was really unique and really well done. And it's like, it's amazing scenes like those are in this movie. And they keep popping up. They're not all at once. They're sprinkled throughout the movie to kind of keep tricking you into thinking, oh, maybe the movie's alright. And yeah, so it's really frustrating when you see the promise in a lot of these scenes. But they're like so few and far between, as far as like, we get a lot more of the I'm really not into this than the genuinely decent scenes. But like I said, it's almost annoying that the decent scenes are in it throughout. It's just, they're not a lot of the movie in total, so there's that. And it's also, for a while there in like the Jude Law scenes, the tone feels a little weird, where everything is like super duper dark and bleak because of the plot, obviously, and the story, and then what it is she's doing here. But then suddenly, during some of these training scenes with Jude Law, it's like they're trying to be light suddenly. Like they have a moment where she pushes Jude Law's car into the woods, and I swear to God, when the camera kind of lingered on Law, I was expecting to start hearing the Curb Your Enthusiasm music. That scene where they're fighting, I was kind of distracted by the music is almost like playful. And I know it's them sort of training and everything, so I guess it's not too unfitting, but it's kind of... That may have been another reason why I didn't realize for so long that it was like one shot, because I was distracted by like, well, that's odd music to play this time, but alright. Like everything was trying to be all tense up to this point, but whatever. So, and then also the editing is kind of all over the place. There's a lot of moments where like, especially like the Sterling K. Brown scenes, it's where it's like we're looking at something, and then while this scene is still happening and the audio is still happening, we seem to be cutting the things that are just unrelated and irrelevant, and then cutting back for some reason. And there's like, every now and then there's like a few awkward transitions that are just like, alright, I guess that scene was over, or, oh, this is how this scene starts, what the hell. So yeah, I hardly know what to make of this, because there's some stuff in there that's really good, and there's a lot in there that's really fucking not. So, yeah, and the ending is like very, very abrupt, because they're doing the whole thing where it's like, there's a secret villain. It's like, oh, well, it's like, nobody knows what this villain looks like. He only goes by this name, and he is the ultimate dude. He's the one at the top of everything. And it's like, oh, I'll bet that's totally not going to be a character we've already seen in the movie. Why else would they do that? It's not going to be just some random dipshit we've never seen before when he's revealed. What kind of reveal would that be? But then the ending is like, you're that guy. There's no, like, it's, like, I'm still trying to register how she found out. Because it's so abrupt. But that's how much the movie cares, I guess. So, that's basically what the rhythm section was. So, like I said, she's still a very promising director, but we'll see. We'll see what happens next. Maybe the good stuff in this will carry over more than the shitty stuff in this into her next project, so we'll see what happens. So, next week is it Birds of Prey already? I think it is. And then maybe one or two other things. I guess we'll see what comes out on like the on-demand or streaming releases or whatever the hell. And then, yeah, and then we'll go from that, and we're almost done. We've got, like, barely a week left of award stuff, and then I guess we'll see what happens with all that. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.